The history of the most controversial, ruthless, and sophisticated assassination campaign of the 20th century does not begin with the crack of a silenced pistol in a Parisian alleyway. It begins with a silence of a different kind, the terrifying, suffocating silence that falls over a room when the realization of a massacre becomes undeniable. To understand why a man named Basil al-Kubaisi had to die on a rainy night in April 1973, we must first travel back 7 months in time, crossing the borders of Europe to a city that was trying desperately to escape its own shadow, Munich, West Germany. It is late summer 1972. The games of the XX Olympiad are underway. For the West German government, these games are not merely a sporting event. They are a geopolitical exorcism. 36 years earlier, Adolf Hitler had turned the Berlin Olympics into a propaganda cathedral for the Third Reich, hanging swastika banners alongside the Olympic rings, and using the prowess of Aryan athletes to justify a philosophy of hate. Now, a new Germany wants to show the world a different face, open, democratic, pacifist, and welcoming. They call them the Happy Games, Die Hydern Spiel. To maintain this illusion of peace, security has been deliberately, almost criminally, dismantled. The Munich police are instructed to wear non-threatening pastel blue uniforms. They carry no weapons, not even batons. The perimeter fences of the Olympic Village are made of chain-link mesh, barely 2 meters high. Not designed to keep people out, but to create an atmosphere of transparency. It is a security setup built on hope, ignoring the tectonic plates of rage shifting beneath the surface of the Middle East. Inside the village, at 31 Kanalstrasse, the Israeli delegation is sleeping. They have spent the evening of September 4th enjoying the city, watching a performance of Fiddler on the Roof. There is a bitter, almost unbearable poetic irony in this. Descendants of Holocaust survivors watching a play about Jewish persecution in the heart of Germany, hours before they are to be hunted down. At 4:10 a.m. on September 5th, the illusion of safety breaks forever. 8 men approach the perimeter fence near Gate 25A. They are dressed in tracksuits, carrying large gym bags. To a passing postman who sees them, they look like athletes sneaking back into the village after a night of partying. The postman, buying into the spirit of the games, actually helps them lift their bags over the fence. He does not know that the heavy thud of the bags hitting the grass is not the sound of dirty laundry or athletic gear. It is the sound of AKM assault rifles with folding stocks, Tokarev TT-33 pistols, and Soviet-made fragmentation grenades. These men are not athletes. They are Black September. They are the radical edge of the Palestine Liberation Organization, born from the ashes of the conflict in Jordan 2 years prior. They move with a singular, lethal purpose towards the Israeli quarters. The assault on apartment 1 begins at 4:30 a.m. Josef Gutfreund, a wrestling referee with the build of bear, hears a scratching noise at the door. The sound is wrong. It is too early for room service, too aggressive for a teammate. He gets up to investigate. As he cracks the door open, he sees the glint of steel barrels and the masked faces of men screaming in Arabic. Gutfreund acts on pure instinct. He throws his massive 300-pound frame against the door, screaming warnings to his roommates. Hevra, to Staku. Guys, get out. For vital seconds, his brute strength holds back 8 armed terrorists. This act of heroism allows Tuvia Sokolovsky, a weightlifting coach, to smash a window and flee into the darkness. But the door eventually gives way. What follows is a descent into medieval brutality inside a modern apartment complex. The terrorists round up the Israelis from apartment 1 and apartment 3. Moshe Weinberg, the wrestling coach, realizes the situation is terminal. He decides to fight. He grabs a fruit knife from a nearby table and lunges at the terrorist leader, a man known by the code name Issa, whose face is covered in charcoal. Weinberg manages to slash Issa across the chest, but is immediately shot through the cheek. The bullet exits behind his ear. He is still standing, bleeding profusely, when he attacks again, knocking a terrorist unconscious with a punch that breaks a man's jaw. He is then executed with a burst of automatic fire. His body is thrown onto the street outside as a grim statement of intent, a visceral warning to the German police gathering outside. Yosef Romano, a weightlifter and veteran of the Six-Day War, also refuses to submit. Despite being on crutches from a knee injury, He snatches an AK-47 from a terrorist. The gun jams, or perhaps he doesn't know how to disengage the safety mechanism in the heat of the moment. He is shot, castrated, and left to bleed to death in front of his bound teammates. By 5 a.m., 9 Israelis are bound together in a small bedroom. They sit in their own blood, surrounded by the smell of cordite and fear. Outside, the German response is a catastrophe of incompetence. The police chief, Manfred Schreiber, attempts to negotiate, but he has no leverage. The terrorists demand the release of 234 prisoners held in Israel and the founders of the Baader-Meinhof gang held in Germany. Israel's response, delivered by Prime Minister Golda Meir from Jerusalem, is absolute. We do not negotiate with terrorists. The Germans prepare a rescue operation that borders on farce. Police officers dress in tracksuits, carrying submachine guns, crawl onto the roof of the building. But they have forgotten one crucial detail. The raid is being broadcast live on television. The terrorists inside simply turn on the TV and watch the police preparing to attack them. The element of surprise is lost before it is even gained. The operation is aborted. The final act of the tragedy moves to the Fürstenfeldbruck air base. The Germans promise the terrorists safe passage to Cairo. It is a lie. They plan to ambush them on the tarmac. But the plan is flawed at a molecular level. German intelligence estimates there are 5 terrorists. There are 8. The snipers deployed are not special forces. They are regular police officers who have no radios to communicate with each other and no night vision scopes. They are positioned in the dark, looking into the lights of the helicopters, effectively blinded. At 11 p.m., the firefight begins. It is chaotic, loud, and ineffective. The terrorists, realizing they are trapped, turn their weapons on hostages. A terrorist tosses a hand grenade into the cockpit of one of the helicopters. The explosion incinerates the bound Israelis inside. In the other helicopter, another terrorist sprays the interior with gunfire. When the smoke clears after midnight on September 6th, the count is total. 11 Israelis dead, 5 terrorists dead, 1 German policeman dead. The world watches in horror as Jim McKay, the ABC Sports anchor, looks into the camera, drained of all hope, and utters the words that will define the decade. They're all gone. The coffins arrive in Tel Aviv on September 7th. The atmosphere in Israel is not just one of mourning. It is one of suffocation. To understand the psychological impact of Munich, one must understand the Israeli mindset of 1972. The state is young, not yet 25 years old. The Holocaust is not history. It is living memory. The people walking the streets of Tel Aviv have numbers tattooed on their forearms. Munich was not just a terrorist attack. It was a recurrence of the ultimate nightmare. Jews, helpless and bound, being murdered on German soil while the civilized world watched and did nothing. The trust in international justice, already fragile, shattered completely. In the Knesset and in the cafes of Jerusalem, the conversation shifted. The doctrine of security through defense was questioned. Defense had failed. Defenses had failed. The German police had failed. The Olympic spirit had failed. If the world would not police the terrorists, Israel would have to do it herself. But how? An invasion of Arab countries was impossible. It would trigger a regional war. The response had to be different. It had to be personal. It had to be a message sent not to armies, but to individuals. It had to say, "You are not safe." Prime Minister Golda Meir, a woman of steel and smoke, convened her cabinet committee on security. This group, which would become known as Committee X, operated in the deepest shadows of the Israeli state. Golda sat at the head of the table. She smoked incessantly, filling the room with a gray haze. Her eyes were heavy with the weight of the decision she was about to make. She looked at General Aaron Yariv and Mossad Chief Zvi Zamir. The directive she gave them was unprecedented in the history of democratic nations. She authorized a global campaign of targeted assassination. There would be no trials. There would be no extradition requests. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. This was the birth of Operation Wrath of God, Mivsa Zamhael. The Mossad was tasked with creating a target list. They did not want the foot soldiers. They wanted the brains. They wanted the men who sat in clean offices in Europe and planned the carnage. The intelligence analysts began to sift through the mountains of data that had been gathered over years of surveillance on the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They looked for the logisticians, the financiers, the intellectuals. Slowly, a list of names emerged. 11 names, mirroring the 11 athletes who had died. At the top of the priority list for Europe was a man living a comfortable, respected life in Paris. His name was Basil al-Kubaisi. To the neighbors in his upscale Parisian apartment building, Basil al-Kubaisi was a charming intellectual. He was a doctor of law, a graduate of the University of Baghdad, and a scholar who had studied in Canada. He spoke eloquently about the plight of the Palestinian refugees. He wrote articles for leftist magazines. He attended dinner parties where he discussed philosophy and politics. But the Mossad file on Kubaisi painted a different picture. It described a man who was a logistical backbone of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, in Europe. Kubaisi was the Quartermaster of Terror. He was a man who knew how to move 40 Kalashnikov rifles from a warehouse in Bulgaria to a safe house in Germany without alerting customs. He was the man who provided the fake passports that allowed terrorists to slip through airports. Intelligence linked him directly to the massacre at Lod Airport in Tel Aviv earlier that year, where Japanese Red Army terrorists, recruited and armed by the PFLP, had machine-gunned 26 civilians. He was also implicated in a plot to assassinate Golda Meir herself. The Mossad determined that Kubaisi was a force multiplier. As long as he was alive, the pipelines of weapons and money flowing into Europe would remain open. Killing him was not just an act of vengeance. It was a tactical necessity to disrupt the infrastructure of future attacks. But killing a man in Paris is not simple. France is a sovereign nation with a powerful police force and a sophisticated counterintelligence service, the DST. An operation on French soil carried immense diplomatic risk. If Israeli agents were caught standing over a body in the 8th arrondissement, the political fallout could isolate Israel from its few remaining allies in Europe. The mission required a surgeon's touch. It required the Qaidon. The Qaidon, Hebrew for bayonet, is the tip of the spear of the Mossad Caesarea division. These are not James Bond caricatures. They are men and women chosen for their ability to blend in, to be forgettable. They are trained to operate under extreme psychological pressure, living deep cover lives for months at a time. In the spring of 1973, the Qaidon teams began to infiltrate Paris. They did not arrive together. That would be amateurish. They trickled in one by one, on different flights, arriving at Orly and Le Bourget airports. They carried passports from Canada, Belgium, the UK, and Italy. They were tourists, businessmen, students. They stayed in different hotels and rented discreet apartments in the suburbs. They never met in large groups. Communication was handled through dead drops, messages left in magnetic containers attached to the underside of park benches or inside public toilet cisterns, and through brief, coded bursts over secure radio frequencies. The surveillance of Basil al-Kubaisi began in March 1973. It was a grinding, tedious process. A team of Yarbal agents, the eyes of Mossad, began to map his life. They watched his apartment building around the clock. They trailed him to the university. They sat at tables near him in cafes, listening to his conversations. They learned his habits, his gait, the brand of cigarettes he smoked. They learned that he was cautious, but arrogant. He believed that his status as an academic and the unspoken truce between the French government and Palestinian groups protected him. He walked the streets of Paris with the confidence of a man who believes he is untouchable. The Yarbal team identified his vulnerability, his routine. Kubaisi was a creature of habit. He often dined late at the Café de la Paix or other bistros in the Opera District, and he almost always walked home to his apartment on Rue Chauveau-Lagarde. The planners in Tel Aviv studied the maps of the 8th arrondissement. They zoomed in on Rue Chauveau-Lagarde. It was a street lined with heavy stone buildings, classic Haussmann architecture. At night, the lighting was uneven. There were stretches of sidewalk that fell into deep shadow between the street lamps. It was quiet, with relatively low foot traffic after 10 p.m. It was a natural kill zone. The plan was set. The execution date was marked for April 6, 1973. The agents prepared their weapons. The choice of firearm was specific. The Beretta Model 71, chambered in .22 caliber. To the uninitiated, a .22 sounds like a weak round, barely suitable for hunting rabbits. But the Mossad favor it for urban assassinations for 3 reasons. First, it is exceptionally quiet, especially when fitted with a suppressor. Second, the low recoil allows the shooter to fire multiple rounds in rapid succession with pinpoint accuracy. Third, the bullet tends to ricochet off bone inside the body, causing massive internal trauma without exiting, which minimizes the risk of hitting a bystander. The agents loaded their magazines with subsonic ammunition, wiped the casings clean of fingerprints, and waited for the sun to set over Paris. On the evening of April 6, 1973, the trap was finally primed. Basil al-Kubaisi finished his dinner at the Café de la Paix. He paid the bill in cash, francs, crisp and untraceable, the preferred currency of the clandestine world. He stood up, adjusted his trench coat against the damp chill of the Parisian spring, and stepped out onto the boulevard des Capucines. It was 10:30 p.m. The city was winding down. The traffic on the wide boulevards had thinned to a steady, rhythmic hum, tires hissing on the wet asphalt. Kubaisi took a deep breath of the night air, unaware that it would be one of his last. He turned toward the Madeleine Church and began his walk home. He was a man of routine, and in the world of shadows, routine is the architect of death. He did not notice the signal. Across the street, a man dropped a newspaper into a trash can. It was a mundane action, invisible to the untrained eye, but it sent a shockwave down the surveillance chain. Radios clicked in parked cars blocks away. The package is moving. The Yarborough surveillance team began to peel away, dissolving into the city like mist. Their job was done. The target was acquired. The route was confirmed. Now, the stage belonged to the Kaidan. Kubaisi turned onto Rue Chauveau-Lagarde. The street was darker here. The Grand Haussmann buildings loomed over the narrow sidewalk like stone cliffs, blocking out the ambient glow of the city lights. The canopy of plane trees filtered the street lamps, creating pools of ink-black shadow. The sound of the city faded. All that remained was the rhythmic click-clack of Kubaisi's leather shoes on the pavement. He was alone, or so he thought. 2 men were walking behind him. They did not run. Running draws the eye. They walked with a synchronized, purposeful briskness, closing the gap with terrifying efficiency. They were dressed in unremarkable coats, looking like 2 friends hurrying home out of the drizzle. Kubaisi slowed down. Perhaps he heard a footfall that was too close. Perhaps the primal instinct that kept him alive through years of conspiracy flared up in his lizard brain. He sensed a presence. He stopped and began to turn his head, his hand instinctively, futilely, reaching toward his pocket. He never saw the faces of his executioners. The lead agent closed the distance to less than 2 meters. He invaded Kubaisi's personal space, violating the instinctive safety zone humans keep around themselves. There was no dramatic speech. There was no, this is from Munich. Professionalism demands silence. The agent raised his right hand. The barrel of the Beretta Model 71, elongated by the custom-made suppressor, was inches from Kubaisi's chest. Phut, phut. The sound was ridiculously small. It did not sound like a weapon of war. It sounded like a book falling flat on a carpet or a champagne cork popping in another room. The subsonic .22 caliber rounds did not have the kinetic energy to throw a man backward. Physics in real life is not like the movies. Kubaisi simply froze. The bullets punched through his heavy wool coat, pierced the skin, and ricocheted off his ribs, tumbling through his lungs and heart. His body went into immediate shock. He stood there for a fraction of a second, his eyes widening behind his glasses, a look of profound confusion etched onto his face. Then the second agent moved in. Mossad doctrine is built on redundancy. If the first gun jams, the second fires. If the first shooter misses, the second connects. Phut, phut, phut. The agents fired in a rapid, staccato rhythm, targeting the chest and then the head. 9 shots were fired in less than 3 seconds. The only light was a brief, dull flash from the muzzles, instantly swallowed by the night. Kubaisi's legs gave way. He didn't fall dramatically. He crumpled. He slid down the rough stone wall of the building, leaving a smear of dark crimson on the gray masonry. He hit the wet pavement with a heavy, wet thud. His glasses skittered across the sidewalk. The silence rushed back into the street instantly. The agents did not panic. This is the hardest part in assassination, the discipline to override the fight-or-flight response. Every nerve in their body screamed at them to run, to sprint, to put distance between themselves and the corpse. But they fought it down. They holstered their warm weapons beneath their coats. They adjusted their collars. They scanned the street 360 degrees. It was empty. The rain had kept the witnesses away. They turned and walked away, turning the corner onto the Rue de l'Arcade and vanishing into the labyrinth of the Paris metro system. Behind them, Basil al-Kubaisi lay dying in the gutter. The architect of logistics, the man who moved weapons across continents, was now just a body on a sidewalk, his lifeblood mixing with the dirty rainwater, flowing toward the sewer grate. The operation was over. The message had been delivered. 5 minutes later, the first scream tore through the night. A couple walking their dog had found the body. Windows flew open. Lights flicked on. Sirens began to wail in the distance, the frantic, two-tone hee-haw of the French police. But they were racing toward a crime scene that was already cold. The killers were gone. The weapons were already being dismantled and scattered into the Seine. The ghost of Paris had claimed another soul. The death of Kubaisi sent a seismic shockwave for the Palestinian terrorist networks in Europe. In the safe houses of Rome, Berlin, and Geneva, panic set in. This was not a battlefield casualty in the West Bank. This was a senior operative killed in the heart of a European capital, under the nose of the French Republic. The unspoken rule that Europe was a sanctuary had been shattered. Men who had walked with the swagger of untouchables began to look over their shoulders. They changed apartments nightly. They canceled meetings. They stopped answering their phones. The psychological objective of Operation Wrath of God, to instill a paralyzing terror in the enemy, was beginning to take root. But for the planners in Tel Aviv, the death of Kubaisi was merely the opening salvo. It was a surgical strike, a precise removal of a single node in the terror network. What followed 3 days later would be a hammer blow. The target shifted from the gray streets of Paris to the sun-drenched coast of Lebanon. The operation was codenamed Spring of Youth, Aviv Nurim. It would be the most audacious Special Forces raid in the history of Israel. The intelligence for this operation had been gathering for months. The Mossad had located the apartments of 3 top Black September and Fatah commanders in Beirut. Mohammed Youssef al-Najjar, known as Abu Yusuf, the operational head of Black September, Kamal Adwan, who coordinated attacks in the West Bank, and Kamal Nasser, the PLO spokesman. Unlike Kubaisi, who lived in the shadows, these men lived in the center of the Palestinian stronghold in West Beirut. They were surrounded by thousands of armed militia fighters. They lived in high-rise apartments on Rue Verdun, a district that was considered a fortress. They believed they were safe because they were in enemy territory, where no Israeli agent could reach them. To get to them, the IDF would have to do the unthinkable: land an amphibious force in the enemy capital, infiltrate the city center, assassinate the leaders in their own bedrooms, and escape before the entire PLO army could wake up. The planning was assigned to Seret Matkul, the General Staff Reconnaissance Unit, Israel's equivalent of Delta Force or the SAS. The commander of the operation was a young lieutenant colonel named Ehud Barak, a man with a genius-level intellect who would later become the Prime Minister of Israel. On the night of April 9, 1973, the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Beirut was pitch black. The water was calm, masking the silent approach of Israeli Navy missile boats. They cut their engines miles offshore to avoid acoustic detection. On the decks of these boats, 19 commandos from Seret Matkul and the Naval Commando Unit Sheatet 13 were preparing their gear. They checked the waterproof seals on their Uzis and FN pistols. They blackened their faces. But as they boarded the Zodiac rubber dinghies, their appearance changed. They were not dressed as soldiers. They were dressed as civilians. Some wore hippie clothes, bell-bottom jeans, and colorful shirts. Others, including Barak himself, were dressed as women. Barak wore a brunette wig, heavy makeup, and loose-fitting women's trousers to conceal the weapon strapped to his leg. Beside him was Mookie Betzer, another legendary commander, dressed in a sharp blazer. They linked arms. To any observer, they would look like a couple of tourists or lovers out for a late-night stroll in cosmopolitan Beirut. It was a disguise born of necessity. A platoon of soldiers marching down Rue Verdun would be shot instantly. A group of wandering hippies would be ignored. The Zodiacs hit the beach at a secluded spot known as a Dove. Waiting for them in the shadows were Mossad agents who had infiltrated Beirut weeks earlier, posing as eccentric Europeans renting seaside villas. They had large American sedans, Buicks and Plymouths, waiting with engines running. The commandos stripped off their wetsuits, revealing their disguises, and piled into the cars. The drive into the heart of Beirut was surreal. They passed Lebanese police checkpoints. They drove past PLO patrols. Nobody stopped a convoy of American cars filled with laughing tourists. The cars pulled up a block away from the target buildings on Rue Verdun. The commandos exited the vehicles. The street was quiet. Barak and Betzer, arm in arm, walked casually toward the lobby of the building housing Abu Yusuf and Kamal Adwan. Two Palestinian guards sat in the lobby, armed with AK-47s. They were bored, half asleep, expecting trouble come in the form of a tank or a jet, not a brunette woman and her boyfriend. As the Israelis approached the glass doors, the guards barely looked up. When the distance closed to point-blank range, the lovers separated. The silenced Uzis appeared from beneath the jackets and handbags. The guards were neutralized with double taps to the chest before they could even unsling their rifles. The sound was a muffled cough, swallowed by the lobby walls. The team signaled the backup units. The lobby was secure. Now began the ascent. The commandos split into teams and took the stairs, moving with the heavy silence of trained killers. They were racing against time. Any noise will alert the hundreds of PLO fighters in the neighboring refugee camps. Abu Yusuf lived on the 6th floor. The team reached his door. They attached a specially shaped explosive charge to the lock. The explosion was calculated to blow the door inward without bringing the ceiling down. Boom! The door flew off its hinges. The commandos stormed into the dark apartment, weapons raised. Abu Yusuf had been working late in his study. Hearing the blast, he ran into the bedroom. The Israelis swept the room, their flashlights cutting through the dust and smoke. In the chaos, Abu Yusuf's wife threw herself in front of him. In the brutal, split-second calculus of close-quarters combat, there is no time for hesitation or chivalry. A burst of fire cut them both down. Abu Yusuf, the man who had helped approve the Munich Massacre, lay dead on his bedroom floor. The team grabbed documents from his desk, intelligence gold detailing PLO cells across the world, and moved to exit. Simultaneously, on the 2nd floor, the team targeting Kamal Adwan breached his apartment. Adwan was not caught entirely off guard. He was a soldier, and he had an AK-47 near his bed. As the door blew open, he raised his weapon. A firefight erupted in the hallway, the muzzle flashes illuminating the narrow space like strobe lights. Mookie Betzer, leading the charge, fired a burst that struck Adwan in the chest. The terrorist leader fell, his finger tightening on the trigger in a death spasm, sending a spray of bullets into the ceiling. The team confirmed the kill, collected papers, and withdrew. Across the street, the 3rd team had engaged Kamal Nasser. Nasser was a poet and the voice of the movement, not a soldier. He was found sitting at his desk, writing. He was armed with a pistol, but never fired it. He was shot dead where he sat. Legend says the commandos left his pistol on his desk, untouched, a final insult to a man who spoke of war but could not fight it. By now, the element of surprise had evaporated. The explosions and the gunfire had woken the neighborhood. Lights were flicking on in the surrounding buildings. The Lebanese police were alerting headquarters. PLO Land Rovers mounted with heavy machine guns were revving their engines blocks away. The Israeli teams exited the buildings, dragging their only casualty, a paratrooper named Guy Peled who had been wounded in the leg. The street scene on Rue Verdun was now chaotic. A Lebanese gendarmerie Land Rover pulled up, and the officers, confused by the sight of civilians carrying guns, hesitated. The Israeli blocking force, stationed by the cars, opened fire, riddling the police vehicle with bullets. The extraction convoy screeched away, tires smoking, racing back toward the beach. They had been on the ground for less than 30 minutes. Behind them, they left the shattered leadership of the PLO and a city in panic. The message was unequivocal. Israel could walk into your capital, into your home, and kill you in your bedroom. There were no borders anymore. While the raid on Beirut was a tactical triumph that stunned the world with its audacity, it did not end the war. Instead, it poured gasoline on a fire that was already consuming the intelligence agencies of Europe. The conflict shifted gears. It moved away from the spectacular military operations of uniformed commandos and returned to the gutter, to the silent, paranoid world of lonely street corners, rigged telephones, and envelopes packed with Semtex. If Beirut was a hammer blow, what followed was a knife fight in the dark. Black September, humiliated by the loss of its leadership in Lebanon, did not retreat. They evolved. They realized that they could not match the military might of the IDF, so they decided to attack the nerves of the Israeli state. They launched a campaign of psychological terror designed to prove that the Mossad was not invulnerable. They began targeting Israeli intelligence officers directly, attempting to turn the hunters into the prey. The primary weapon of this phase was a letter bomb, a mechanism of indiscriminate cruelty designed to maim the opener in the most intimate setting possible, their own office or home. In late 1972 and throughout 1973, dozens of envelopes flooded Israeli embassies and the homes of suspected agents across Europe. The technology was simple but effective. A thin strip of plastic explosive, often Czechoslovakian-made Semtex, was flattened inside a cardboard envelope. The trigger was a mechanical spring held back by the pressure of the seal flap. The moment the recipient slid a letter opener under flap or tore it open, the spring was released, striking a detonator cap. The blast was rarely large enough to destroy a room, but it was calculated to tear off hands and blind eyes. It was terror arriving with the Morning Post. The most tragic casualty of this paper war occurred in London. Ami Shakori was the agricultural attaché to the Israeli embassy, a covered title for his true role in intelligence. Shakori was a veteran, cautious and trained. He knew the risks, but the sheer volume of mail was overwhelming, and the attackers relied on the law of averages. On September 19, 1972, Shakori sat at his desk and picked up a thick envelope. It looked innocuous. He slid his opener under flap. The explosion was immediate and violent. Shakori took the full force of the blast to his chest and face. He died on the way to the hospital. His death changed the atmosphere within the Mossad. It was no longer just a mission to protect the state. It was now a blood feud. The agency realized that their list was not just a tool of justice, but a defensive necessity. If they did not kill the bomb makers, the bombs would keep coming. This escalation led to one of the darkest and least discussed chapters of the Wrath of God, the assassination of Baruch Cohen. Cohen was a Katsa, a Mossad case officer operating in Madrid. He was a brilliant recruiter, a man who specialized in turning Palestinians into informants. He posed as a businessman, meeting his contact in cafes and parks, using charm and money to gather intelligence. But in the shadows of Madrid, Black September had laid a trap. They had identified Cohen not as a businessman, but as a spy. They fed him a false lead, promising him a meeting with a high-level defector. On January 26, 1973, Cohen arranged a meeting with one of his contacts near the famous Grand Via. It was a busy morning. The Spanish sun was bright. Cohen sat at a cafe table, waiting. He checked his watch. He scanned the crowd. He was approached not by his contact, but by two young men who moved with the nervous energy of amateurs. But their guns were real. They shot Cohen 3 times in the chest at point-blank range. Baruch Cohen collapsed, knocking over his coffee cup, and died on the sidewalk of a foreign city, far from home. The gunman vanished into the crowd. The death of a Mossad officer in the field is a rare and catastrophic event. It shook the agency to its core. It proved that the enemy had counterintelligence capabilities that Israel had underestimated. Black September wasn't just reacting. They were hunting. The gloves came off completely. The rules of engagement, which had already been loose, were effectively dissolved. The Mossad began to target not just the high-level commanders, but the middlemen, the couriers, and the contact men in Europe. The streets of Rome, Cyprus, and Athens became battlegrounds. One such target was Zayad Machasi, the replacement for a previously assassinated Fatah operative in Cyprus. Mossad was holed up in a hotel room in Athens, believing he was safe. The Mossad didn't bother with a complex shooting or a risky infiltration. They simply used an incendiary bomb. On April 11, 1973, a device planted in his room detonated. It didn't just kill him. It obliterated the room with fire. The message was savage: we will burn you out. Meanwhile, the technological arm of the Mossad was working overtime to solve a particularly difficult problem in Paris. The target was Mahmoud Hamshari, the PLO representative in France and the coordinator of the Munich attacks logistics. Hamshari was a survivor. He knew he was on the list. After the death of Kubaisi, he had turned his apartment into a fortress. He rarely left, and when he did, he was surrounded by guards. Shooting him on the street was impossible. Breaking into his apartment while he was there would result in a shootout with French police. So, the Mossad decided to bring the death to him, using a method that remains legendary in the annals of espionage. It required the Neviate, the break-in experts. The plan relied on Hamshari's one vulnerability: his telephone. He spent hours on it every day, coordinating the network. First, a Mossad agent posing as an Italian journalist began calling Hamshari, requesting an interview. He was persistent but polite. Hamshari, eager to present the Palestinian cause to the European press, eventually agreed to meet him at a cafe. This was a window. While Hamshari was out meeting the fake journalist, a team of Neviate picked the lock of his apartment. They moved quickly. They did not plant a bomb under the bed or in a closet. Instead, they went to his desk. They disconnected his telephone and replaced the base of the unit with an identical replica. Inside the new base was a sophisticated explosive charge, shaped to direct the blast upwards, and a remote detonator. The team left. Everything was exactly as it had been. Hamshari returned from a meeting, frustrated that the Italian journalist had been delayed, but unsuspecting. On December 8, 1972, the phone rang. It was a journalist again. "Is this Mr. Hamshari?" the voice asked. "Yes, it is," Hamshari replied, holding the receiver to his ear. That confirmation was the signal. The agent on the other end of the line didn't detonate the bomb. A nearby support team, parked in a van outside and listening to the specific frequency of the bug, sent the electronic signal. Click. The explosion was small, contained, and devastating. The shaped charge blasted upwards through the receiver, directly into Hamshari's head. It did not destroy the room. It did not hurt his family in the other room. It was a sniper shot made of explosives. Hamshari did not die immediately. He lingered in a Paris hospital for weeks, in agony, long enough to tell the French police exactly what had happened. He died knowing that his own phone had betrayed him. The operation was a technological masterpiece, cementing Mossad's reputation as an agency that could touch anyone, anywhere, by any means. These operations, the letter bombs, the murder of Baruch Cohen, the burning hotel room in Athens, the exploding telephone, created an atmosphere of total paranoia in Europe. By mid-1973, the continent was a nervous wreck. Police forces in France, Italy, and Germany were chasing phantoms. Every unattended bag at an airport was a potential bomb. Every Middle Eastern diplomat was a potential target. The geopolitical strain was immense. European leaders pressured Golda Meir to stop the campaign, threatening sanctions and diplomatic isolation. But Meir was immovable. She saw the campaign not as a choice, but as the only wall standing between Israel and a wave of terror that would make Munich look like a prelude. However, the human cost on the Israeli side was mounting. The agents of the Qaeda were not machines. They were men and women living under unbearable stress. They were operating on little sleep, constantly looking over their shoulders, fueled by cigarettes, caffeine, and a burning desire for revenge that began to cloud their judgment. They were hunting ghosts in a hall of mirrors. The discipline that had characterized the early hits, the patience of the Kubaisi surveillance, the precision of the Hamshari bomb, began to fray. Fatigue is the enemy of tradecraft, and as the summer of 1973 approached, the pressure to catch the big fish, Ali Hassan Salameh, the Red Prince, would lead them away from the familiar streets of Paris to a sleepy town in Norway, where the thin line between justice and murder would finally be crossed. If Paris was a surgical success of the wrath of God, and Beirut was its audacious military crescendo, then Lillehammer was its tragic, freezing graveyard. By July 1973, the operational tempo of the Mossad in Europe had reached a fever pitch. The Qaeda units had been living in the shadows for 10 months. They were exhausted. The adrenaline that fuels covert operations is a finite resource, and when it runs dry, it is replaced by fatigue, paranoia, and a dangerous kind of tunnel vision. The agents were no longer seeing the world clearly. They were seeing it through the crosshairs of a mission that had no end in sight, and the pressure from Tel Aviv was suffocating. The Prime Minister and the Mossad chief, Zvi Zamir, wanted the head of the snake. They wanted Ali Hassan Salameh. Ali Hassan Salameh, known as the Red Prince, was a flamboyant chief of operations for Black September. He was the man Israeli intelligence held directly responsible for planning the Munich Massacre. Unlike the shadowy logisticians like Kubaisi, who lived quiet lives, Salameh lived in the spotlight. He was a playboy who drove sports cars to the ruins of Beirut, married a former Miss Universe, Georgina Rizek, and moved with a swagger that infuriated his hunters. He believed he was invincible, protected not only by his army of PLO bodyguards, but also by a secret relationship he had cultivated with the CIA, acting as a back-channel intermediary between the Americans and Yasser Arafat. For nearly a year, he had slipped through every trap set for him. He was the ghost that haunted the Mossad, the one who got away. In July 1973, a piece of intelligence landed on a desk in Tel Aviv. It was raw, unverified, and dangerously seductive. It suggested that Salameh had left the safety of Beirut and traveled to a small resort town in Norway called Lillehammer. The report claimed he was there to organize a new terror network in Scandinavia. The Mossad leadership, desperate for a win after the grueling war of attrition in Europe, bit the hook. They abandoned their methodical protocols. There was no time for the weeks of patient surveillance that had preceded the Kubaisi hit. A team was assembled in haste. It was a motley crew, a mix of seasoned veterans from the Paris operations who were burnt out and inexperienced support agents who had not been properly vetted for field work. They converged on Lillehammer, a town so small, pristine, and quiet that a group of strangers driving rental cars stood out like a neon sign in a dark room. Lillehammer in the summer is a place of endless daylight, the white nights. There is no darkness to hide in. The locals notice the strangers immediately. They notice the cars circling. They notice the men speaking Hebrew and French in low voices at cafes. The element of surprise, the Mossad's greatest weapon, was lost before the operation even began. The target they identified was a man living quietly in a modest apartment. He looked somewhat like Salameh. He had a mustache. He had a darker complexion than the Norwegians. He spoke French. But he did not act like a terrorist chieftain. He didn't check for tails. He rode a bicycle to the public swimming pool. He worked as a waiter at a local health bath. He walked hand in hand with his pregnant Norwegian wife. His name was Ahmed Bachiki, a Moroccan immigrant who had absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. He was a man who just wanted to live a peaceful life. But the Mossad team was blinded by confirmation bias, the psychological tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs. They saw the Red Prince because they needed it to be the Red Prince. They interpreted his lack of security not as innocence, but as a brilliant cover. They interpreted his bicycle rides not as leisure, but as counter-surveillance. The team leader, Mike Harari, usually a man of impeccable judgment, failed to call it off. The thirst for revenge had clouded the clarity of the mission. On the night of July 21st, 1973, the team made their move. The sun had dipped below the horizon, but the sky was still awash in the twilight of the Nordic summer. Bachiki and his wife had just come from a movie theater. They were walking home, chatting, perhaps discussing the baby that was due in a few months. As they walked up a gentle hill near their apartment, a white Mazda pulled up beside them. Two agents stepped out. They did not hesitate. In the stark, cold light, they fired 14 shots. Bachiki fell into the grass. His wife, screaming, threw herself over his body, but it was too late. The agents jumped back into the car and sped off, tires screeching on the quiet asphalt. But Norway was not France. The police were not indifferent or slow. They were efficient, suspicious, and quick. The getaway was clumsy. An alert neighbor had noted the license plate of the Mossad. Within hours, the Norwegian police had set up roadblocks. The agents, unfamiliar with the terrain and panicking, made rookie mistakes. 2 of them were intercepted at the airport while trying to return a rental car. What they were carrying was a disaster. They had the phone numbers of the safe houses in their pockets. They had the keys to the other cars. They had maps with the escape routes marked. The dominoes fell with terrifying speed. The police raided the safe house. They arrested 6 Mossad agents. What followed was an intelligence disaster of unprecedented scale. Under interrogation, some of the less experienced agents broke. They were not hardened soldiers. They were terrified support staff. They revealed the network. They revealed the codes. They revealed the phone numbers of safe houses in Paris, Amsterdam, and Rome. The entire infrastructure of the wrath of God in Europe was exposed. The list was no longer a secret. It was front-page news. Israel was humiliated diplomatically. The world saw the dark underbelly of the secret war. Not heroic super spies saving the world, but a group of terrified, incompetent people who had just murdered an innocent waiter in front of his pregnant wife. The moral high ground that Israel had claimed after Munich evaporated in the cool air of a Norwegian courtroom. The agents were put on trial. 5 were convicted and imprisoned. Israel had to pay compensation to the Bachiki family, though they refused to admit official culpability for years. Golda Meir, shaken by the fiasco and facing immense international pressure, ordered a suspension of operations. The wrath of God went dormant. The gun was put back in the drawer. The safe houses were abandoned. The agents who managed to escape scattered back to Israel, carrying the weight of their failure. But memory in the Middle East is long. The failure at Lillehammer did not save Ali Hassan Salameh. It only bought him time. He watched the news from Beirut, laughing, believing he had defeated the Mossad. He became even more brazen. He gave interviews to Western magazines. He lived like a king. He did not know that the file on his desk in Tel Aviv had not been closed. It had merely been put aside. 5 years would pass. Governments would change. Golda Meir would resign. But the institutional memory of the Mossad is eternal. A new prime minister, Munich begin, would come to power. A man who had been a revolutionary himself. A man who believed that justice has no expiration date. In 1978, he would reopen the file. He would call the new chief of the Mossad and give a simple order: finish it. The hunt for the Red Prince was back on. But this time, they would not send a team of tired agents to a small town. They would send a ghost into the heart of the fire. They would recruit an unlikely agent, a quiet, eccentric British woman with a sketchbook, who would walk into the lion's den of Beirut and paint the crosshairs on the chest of the man who thought he was untouchable. The final act of the tragedy was about to begin. By 1978, the political landscape of Israel had shifted tectonically. Munich begin was now prime minister. Unlike Golda Meir, who viewed targeted killings as a grim necessity, Begin was a former revolutionary commander of the Irgun. He understood the language of violence fluently. He had no patience for the diplomatic niceties that had restrained the previous administration after the Lillehammer disaster. When the file on Ali Hassan Salameh was placed on his desk, his response was brief and unequivocal. He did not ask about the diplomatic risks. He simply asked, "Why is this man still alive?" The order was given to the new chief of the Mossad, Yitzhak Hafi. The wrath of God was waking up from its 5-year slumber. But this time, the rules would be different. There would be no team of nervous amateurs in a rental car. This would be a phantom operation, the most complex assassination plot in the history of the agency. The target, Ali Hassan Salameh, was living in the eye of the storm. Beirut in 1979 was a city torn apart by civil war, a patchwork of militias, checkpoints, and rubble. But Salameh floated above the chaos. He was a Red Prince, the favorite son of the PLO, and he lived with the impunity of a warlord. He drove a convoy of American Chevrolet station wagons. He was surrounded by a Praetorian Guard of Force 17 commandos. He believed he was untouchable, protected by his fortress in West Beirut, and his secret back-channel connections to Western intelligence agencies who viewed him as a potential political moderate. To kill a man this protected, you cannot simply shoot him. You have to erase him. The Mossad needed eyes inside the fortress. They needed an agent who could live on Salameh's doorstep without raising suspicion. Enter Agent Penelope. Her real name was Erica Chambers. She was not Israeli. She was a British citizen, a quiet, somewhat eccentric woman in her 30s with a legitimate passport and a background that screamed harmless. She arrived in Beirut carrying a sketchbook and a set of paints. Her cover story was perfect in its banality. She was an artist drawn to the tragedy of Lebanon, seeking to capture the sorrow of the civil war on canvas. She was a ghost in plain sight. Chambers rented an apartment on Rue Verdun. It was a calculated choice. The apartment was not chosen for its light or its amenities. It was chosen for its balcony. It looked directly down onto a specific intersection, a choke point that Salameh's convoy had to pass every day to get from his headquarters to his home, where his wife, Georgina Rizik, lived. For months, Chambers played the role. She painted street scenes. She befriended the local shopkeepers. She fed the stray cats of the neighborhood. She became a fixture of the street, the crazy English painter who hurt no one. But behind the easel, she was working. She memorized the rhythm of the Red Prince's life. She noted the number of cars in his convoy. She noted the speed at which they traveled. She noted the specific time, usually around 3:30 p.m., when he returned home. She mapped the kill zone with the precision of a surveyor. While she watched, other teams from the Mossad's technological unit, the dreaded technicians who built the phone bomb for Hamsheri, infiltrated the city. They used Canadian and British passports. They rented a garage. They acquired a Volkswagen Beetle. This car was not a getaway vehicle. It was the weapon. The technicians packed the chassis and the doors of the Volkswagen with 100 kilograms of hexogen, a sophisticated military-grade plastic explosive. They shaped the charge meticulously. This was crucial. They did not want to level the entire apartment block. They needed a shaped charge that would direct the blast wave horizontally, like a scythe, cutting across the street at hip level, directly into the passing cars, while sparing the buildings above. On the morning of January 22, 1979, the Volkswagen was parked on Rue Verdun, just below Erica Chambers' balcony. The trap was set. The technicians vanished. Only Penelope remained. She set up her easel on the balcony. She began to paint. Beside her, hidden under a cloth, was a radio transmitter. At 3:30 p.m., the rumble of engines signaled the arrival of the Red Prince. The convoy turned onto the street. It was moving fast, aggressive, taking up the center of the road. Salameh was in the lead Chevrolet station wagon, driving himself, surrounded by bodyguards. As the cars approached the parked Volkswagen, time seemed to stretch. Chambers looked down from her vantage point. She wasn't just an artist anymore. She was a hand of fate. She waited. She let the front bumper of Salameh's car align with the rear bumper of the Volkswagen. She pressed a button. The explosion was cataclysmic. It wasn't the small pop of the Beretta in Paris. It was the roar of judgment. The shockwave shattered windows for a mile. The Volkswagen disintegrated, transforming into thousands of pieces of lethal shrapnel traveling at supersonic speeds. The blast wave hit the Chevrolet broadside. It incinerated the 4 bodyguards in the trailing vehicle instantly. It turned Salameh's car into a twisted cage of burning metal. Salameh was pulled from the wreckage by frantic PLO fighters. He was alive, but only technically. A piece of steel shrapnel had pierced his skull and entered his brain. He was rushed to the American University Hospital, the same place his victims had been taken years before. He died on the operating table at 4:03 p.m. The hunt that had begun in the ashes of Munich 7 years earlier was finally over. The Red Prince was dead. Erica Chambers vanished into the chaos. She left her paintings, her brushes, and her cat behind. She slipped out of Lebanon before the smoke had even cleared, disappearing back into the anonymity from which she came. Her paintings likely still gathered dust in an evidence locker in Beirut, the only witnesses to the final act of the wrath of God. The assassination of Ali Hassan Salameh marked the effective end of the specific campaign launched by Golda Meir. The Mossad had settled its accounts. But the cost had been immense. The operation had spanned almost a decade. It had consumed millions of dollars. It had left a trail of bodies across 2 continents. Terrorists, bystanders, waiters, and agents. It had tested the moral fabric of the Israeli state and changed the rules of international espionage forever. Decades have passed since the smoke cleared over Paris and Beirut. The men who ordered these missions are dead. The agents who pulled the triggers are old, living quietly in Tel Aviv suburbs, carrying their secrets to the grave. Basil al-Kubaisi is a footnote in history books. But the legacy of this operation defines the world we live in today. It established the doctrine of targeted killing that is now used by intelligence agencies from the CIA to the FSB. It erased the line between peace and war. It proved that in the modern age, a battlefield is not a trench in Europe. It is a cafe in Paris, a hotel in Athens, or a street in Norway. Critics argue that the operation was a strategic failure. They point out that the PLO was eventually replaced by Hamas and Hezbollah, organizations even more radical and disciplined. They argue that for every head cut off the Hydra, 2 more grew back, fueled by the martyrdom of the men the Mossad killed. They say that violence only begets violence, spinning the wheel of blood that consumes the Middle East to this day. Supporters, however, argue that on those dark nights in Paris, Beirut, and Rome, innocent lives were saved. They argue that by killing the architect of logistics, the Mossad prevented bombs from exploding and planes from falling out of the sky. They say that the psychological terror inflicted on the terrorists, the fear of the starting car, the fear of the phone call, the fear of the shadow on the street, force the enemy to spend their time hiding instead of planning. They argue that in a world of wolves, the sheep need a shepherd who is willing to carry a sword. Whatever your view, the reality of espionage is rarely black and white. It is gray. It is the color of a rainy street in Paris in April. It is the color of the smoke rising over Rue Verdun. It is the color of the choices men make when they decide to play God in the shadows. Basil al-Kubaisi thought he could wage war from the comfort of a cafe, protected by borders and laws. He learned, too late, that the war eventually comes for everyone. This is the true story of how the Mossad brought the war to Europe. And in the world of shadows, the war never truly ends. It just changes targets.